He thought she was just another face in the crowd. Just another black woman he could talk down to, mock, and dismiss in his courtroom. What he didn't know was that she carried something in her purse that would change everything. And when she revealed it, the entire courthouse fell silent. Welcome to Unheard Evidence, where stories of dignity, injustice, and unexpected power come alive. Tonight, we step into a courtroom where arrogance ruled the bench, until one woman's quiet strength shattered it. Stay with us, because what began as humiliation turned into one of the most unforgettable reversals of justice you'll ever hear. The first sound in the courtroom that morning wasn't the shuffle of papers or the strike of the gavel. It was laughter. A low ripple from the gallery, careless, dismissive, like people waiting for a show. And in a way, that's what this local courthouse had become, a stage where power played itself out at the expense of ordinary lives. The judge walked in with that slow, heavy stride of someone who believed the room belonged to him. His robe flowed, his chin lifted, his smirk already forming before he even took his seat. To him, this wasn't about justice. It was about control. And in that moment, no one in the courtroom could have imagined that the woman sitting quietly 3 rows back was about to change everything. Her name was Danielle Carter. She didn't come for herself. She didn't come to make a scene. She came for her cousin, a young black man cited for a traffic violation that everyone in their family knew wasn't about a missing blinker. It was about who was behind the wheel. Danielle had seen this pattern too many times. Stops that escalated. Tickets that multiplied. And always, the same heavy shadow of bias following her community into courtrooms like this one. She adjusted her navy suit jacket, smoothed her hands across her lap, and sat still. To anyone watching, she was just another family member, polite, reserved, easy to ignore. That's how she wanted it. But the judge had other plans. Next case, he barked, slamming the file against his desk. Let's get this over with. These people keep wasting the court's time. His words weren't hidden, weren't coded. They were direct. These people. The gallery tensed. Danielle's cousin stiffened beside his attorney. And Danielle, for a moment, closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and reminded herself to stay steady. She had faced arrogance before. But something about the way this judge smirked, the way his words dripped with entitlement, hit her deeper than usual. Her cousin's attorney began to speak, laying out the simple facts, the traffic light, the officer's position, the discrepancy in the ticket. But the judge wasn't listening. He leaned back in his chair, eyes rolling, lips curled in mock amusement. And when Danielle rose slightly, only slightly, to request permission to speak on behalf of her cousin, the entire room seemed to shift. The judge leaned forward, one eyebrow raised. And who are you supposed to be? His tone wasn't curiosity. It was insult. Another cousin here to whine about the system? Sit down before I hold you in contempt. A chuckle escaped from the gallery. Someone coughed. Danielle's cousin looked down, ashamed, as though the very act of asking for fairness had put him on trial. And Danielle, still poised, still calm, kept her voice level. Your Honor, she said softly, but firmly, with all due respect, I believe the citation was unjust. I'd like to provide context on behalf of my cousin. But he cut her off, sharp, cruel. Oh, so now we've got lawyers in the audience? Let me guess. Paralegal? Maybe a clerk? No, I know exactly what you are. He leaned forward, his voice louder now, carrying across every corner of the courtroom. You're just another loud black woman thinking you run the show. Well, let me be clear, you don't run anything in here. The words landed heavy. Gasps. A murmur. Danielle's cousin's attorney froze, unsure whether to intervene. Even the bailiff shifted, uneasy. But the judge sat back, smug, believing he had delivered the final word. Danielle didn't flinch. She didn't shout. She didn't storm. She just looked at him, long enough for him to notice the stillness in her eyes. And then, with deliberate calm, she reached into her purse. The judge sneered. What are you doing? This is my courtroom. You don't just pull things out like you're. And then it appeared. A black leather case, worn but polished. She placed it gently on the table before her. Slowly, she opened it. The gallery craned forward, eyes narrowing, lips parting. Inside gleamed the unmistakable seal. The ID card that carried authority beyond this county courthouse. Beyond this smirking local judge. Danielle raised it just enough for the room to see, and the silence that followed was louder than any gavel. "Actually, Your Honor," she said evenly, "I am a judge. A United States federal judge. And in this moment, I'm observing not just the treatment of my cousin, but the conduct of this courtroom." The bailiff froze. The attorney's jaw dropped. Even the gallery sat stunned, unsure whether to breathe. And for the first time that morning, Judge Harker, the man who believed he owned the room, found himself speechless. He stammered, lips fumbling for words. I wasn't aware." Danielle's eyes didn't leave him. Her voice didn't rise, but its weight filled the room. "No. You weren't aware because you didn't care to look. And that is exactly the problem." The courtroom shifted like a tide breaking. Whispers rippled. Eyes widened. The same people who had chuckled at her humiliation now watched in awe as the balance of power flipped before their eyes. Danielle stood slowly, the ID badge still in her hand. "Justice is not yours to mock. It is not yours to twist. It belongs to the people. And when you humiliate, when you belittle, when you degrade, you dishonor the very robe you wear." The silence in the courtroom after her words wasn't an ordinary silence. It was the kind that bends the air, the kind that presses against people's chests until they feel it's their own breath being held hostage. For a moment, no one dared move. Even the old ceiling fan above, which had been rattling against its rusted bolts all morning, seemed to hesitate in mid-spin. Danielle stood there, not taller than before, not louder, but suddenly monumental. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't pointed a finger. But she had cracked open the illusion this courtroom ran on, that the judge was untouchable, that his authority was beyond question, that people like her were supposed to know their place. From the second row, a middle-aged woman leaned forward, clutching her purse. Her eyes darted between the badge in Danielle's hand and the crimson spreading across Judge Harker's cheeks. She whispered, almost to herself, "She's a judge, she's really a judge," and her voice trembled, not with fear but with awe. Behind her, a young man in a work uniform shook his head slowly, a smile tugging at his lips. "About time somebody put him in check," he muttered under his breath. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. He was speaking to the walls, to the rafters, to every ghost of injustice that had ever passed through that courtroom. But the most striking reaction came from the bailiff. A man in his 50s, broad-shouldered, hardened by years of standing silently beside authority, suddenly shifted his stance. His jaw clenched. His hands, usually folded calmly at his belt, twitched against his holster as though instinctively reaching for something: control, order, routine. But then his eyes softened, and for the first time in years, he realized he was witnessing justice that didn't need his weapon, didn't need his restraint. Justice was unfolding without him, and it was truer than anything he'd seen in this courthouse. The judge tried to recover. He leaned forward, his fingers tightening around the gavel like a drowning man clutches driftwood. Danielle cut him off with a look. Not a glare. Not fury. Just the quiet, unflinching stare of a woman who had fought too many battles to be shaken by one arrogant man in a robe. Her voice was measured, deliberate. "You weren't aware because you didn't care to look." The words slid across the polished wood benches, through the murmuring gallery, into the judge's ears like truth sharpened into glass. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, each person replaying the judge's earlier insults in their minds, his sneering "you people," his mocking loud black woman, and now weighing it against the undeniable reality standing before them. Danielle could see the shift in their eyes. The ones who had laughed earlier now avoided her gaze. The ones who had remained silent now looked at her with a mix of shame and admiration. And her cousin was staring at her like he was seeing her for the first time, like he'd never realized how much power dignity could carry until it stood up in front of 100 strangers and refused to bow. The judge cleared his throat. "Case dismissed," he muttered, almost choking on the words. He banged the gavel once, but it didn't sound like authority. It sounded like retreat. And then the whispers began. "She showed him. Never seen anything like that before. That's the federal badge, right? Federal? She put him in his place, didn't she? It spread like wildfire, the kind of hushed awe that turns into legend by the time people leave the building. Danielle didn't bask in it. She didn't even acknowledge it. She simply lowered the badge back into her purse, clipped the case shut, and sat down beside her cousin as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But her cousin couldn't hide it. His eyes glistened, his lips trembled, his hand shook when he reached for hers. "You didn't just save me," he whispered, voice cracking. "You saved all of us in there." Danielle gave his hand a squeeze. "No," she corrected softly, "I reminded them of what they should have known all along." Outside, the courthouse steps buzzed like a hive. Reporters hadn't been there for a minor traffic violation, but word had spread fast. Phones were out, videos already circulating, snippets of her reveal passing from one screen to another. "Federal judge humiliates local judge," the captions would read. But Danielle wasn't thinking about headlines. She was thinking about her father's words from years ago, words that guided her through every courtroom, every injustice she'd ever faced. "Respect isn't a gift. It's a right. And if they forget, you remind them." She had reminded them. But the story didn't end there. In the days that followed, whispers turned into questions. The community began to ask, if this is how the judge treated a federal judge he didn't recognize, how does he treat the everyday people he's supposed to serve? Mothers began retelling the story at church, adding a little more color with each retelling. Fathers brought it up at barbershops, where chairs creaked under the weight of men nodding in agreement. He needed that. Been needing that for years. Teenagers shared clips on TikTok, setting Danielle's words to music, making her stand go viral in ways she never intended but couldn't stop. And then came the fallout. Judge Harker's record was suddenly under a microscope. Old transcripts were pulled. Complaints that had been buried found new light. People who had once been too afraid to speak now found courage. Because they had seen that even someone as powerful as him could be brought down by truth. But while the community buzzed, Danielle stayed quiet. She didn't hold press conferences. She didn't post online. She continued her work, her robe folded neatly in the chambers of her federal courtroom. But inside, she carried a quiet satisfaction. Not pride. Not gloating. Just the knowledge that her silence had ended exactly where it should, when silence turned into complicity. Because silence in that county courtroom would have meant letting humiliation stand. And Danielle Carter was not built to let it stand. The courthouse emptied like a theater after the final act. People didn't just walk out, they carried something with them. They carried a story, one they couldn't wait to repeat. The air outside was thick with murmurs. Some voices hushed, others emboldened, but all of them circling around one woman, Danielle Carter. On the courthouse steps, clusters formed. A construction worker still in his boots leaned against the railing, shaking his head. "Man, you should have seen his face," he said to the woman beside him, who clutched her tote bag tight. "Red as a stop sign. Thought he was king in there," then she flipped the whole script on him. The woman nodded, her voice low but urgent. "I've been coming to this courthouse for years, watching him talk down to people. It's about time somebody made him listen." Farther down the steps, a teenager held up his phone. The shaky recording showed the moment Danielle revealed her badge. The crowd around him leaned in, watching, replaying, whispering. One young woman clapped her hands over her mouth. "She's a federal judge? That's what that badge is." Another replied, "Yep. And he had no clue. That's the best part. Treated her like trash, then got slapped by reality." Phones lit up everywhere. Notifications pinged. By the time Danielle had left quietly with her cousin, the video had already crossed state lines. And by sundown, it was on national feeds. The headline was sharp, catchy, impossible to ignore. Local judge humiliates black woman in court, then she shows her federal judge ID. That headline became a storm. The next morning, the courthouse was buzzing. Not with cases, but with whispers. Staffers huddled in hallways, clerks swapped knowing glances, bailiffs stood quieter than usual. Everyone had seen it. Everyone was talking. "Did you see the clip? 500,000 views overnight. They say she's been a federal judge for almost a decade. And he called her a loud black woman? On record. In front of everyone." The whispers didn't stop at the courthouse doors. They traveled to diners, barbershops, and buses. They slipped into church pews on Sunday mornings, carried by women with fans and men with pressed suits. They rolled through beauty salons, where hands paused mid-braid so someone could replay the clip. And for once, the conversation wasn't about shame. It wasn't about another moment of quiet defeat. It was about victory. A rare, delicious moment of poetic justice, captured in real time. But not everyone was celebrating. In his chambers, Judge Harker sat slumped behind his desk. The blinds were drawn, the air thick with stale coffee and nerves. His robe hung on the back of his chair, lifeless. For years, he'd worn it like armor. Today it felt like a weight. He'd replayed the moment 100 times in his head. Her calm voice. Her badge. The look in the gallery's eyes when they realized who she was. The applause. God, the applause. Judges weren't supposed to be clapped at like rock stars. That was supposed to be his courtroom. His show. Now? He was the punchline. His phone buzzed. He didn't pick it up. It buzzed again. And again. Until finally, with a groan, he snatched it off the desk. It was his clerk. Sir, the voice on the other end said cautiously, the State Judicial Review Board, they've requested a statement. About yesterday. Harker closed his eyes. It's all over the internet, isn't it? A pause. Then the clerk's whisper, yes. Everywhere. He slammed the phone down, his hand trembling. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to be untouchable. That robe had always been his shield. But now the robe felt thin, see-through. He felt exposed. And worse, he felt hunted. Because while Harker tried to salvage his pride, the community was sharpening its memory. In a small cafe across town, an older man stirred his coffee slowly, staring at the steam. His name was Walter Jenkins, retired, but he remembered his own run-ins with Harker. He spoke softly to the young woman sitting across from him. Back in '95, he said, voice heavy, that same man fined me double for something I didn't even do. Laughed in my face when I tried to explain. I'll never forget that look. Like I was beneath him. He shook his head. And now? Tables turned. Took a black woman in a navy suit to do it, but Lord, he got what he deserved. The young woman leaned forward. You think anything's gonna happen to him? Walter's eyes narrowed. Oh, it's happening already. Once the community starts talking, once people start remembering, ain't no stopping it. He's done. And Walter wasn't wrong. By midweek, reporters were camped outside the courthouse. News vans lined the curb. Microphones angled toward anyone willing to speak. One young mother, holding her toddler on her hip, spoke into a camera with conviction. That judge? He's been humiliating folks in this community for years. I've seen him talk down to defendants like they were dirt. But when he tried it on her, and she showed who she really was, that wasn't just her moment. That was ours. Clips like that spread quickly. Networks ran the story, each one with the same grainy footage of Danielle pulling out her badge. Commentators debated it on primetime. Some called it justice. Some called it irony. But everyone agreed, the image of a smug local judge shrinking under the calm authority of a black federal judge was unforgettable. And with every replay, Harker's reputation crumbled further. Investigations were launched. The Judicial Review Board announced an inquiry into his conduct. Old complaints resurfaced, pulled from dusty files, now backed by fresh testimony. Defendants came forward, emboldened. Clerks whispered to reporters. Even attorneys who had once feared his wrath now found their voices. Each story painted the same picture: arrogance, bias, cruelty hidden behind the robe. And now that the world was watching, none of it could be swept under the rug. Meanwhile, Danielle remained silent. She returned to her federal courtroom, handling her docket as usual. Colleagues glanced at her with new admiration, but she brushed it off. She wasn't interested in fame. She was interested in justice. Yet she couldn't ignore the ripple effect. Letters arrived at her office. Some handwritten, some typed. Strangers thanking her. Defendants sharing their stories. Young girls saying they wanted to be like her. One letter stood out. It came from a high school senior named Maya. The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged, but the words burned clear. I've always been scared to speak up when teachers or principals treated me unfair. I thought I had to stay quiet because they had the power. But when I saw you stand up to that judge, I realized silence is how they win. I want to study law now. I want to be like you. Danielle folded the letter gently, pressing her palm against it. She hadn't set out to inspire. She hadn't set out to be recorded, to go viral, to spark a movement. She had simply refused to bow to humiliation. But sometimes, one refusal is enough to light a fire. As for Harker, his downfall came not with a bang, but with a slow, humiliating unraveling. First, the review board suspended him pending investigation. Then local papers ran editorials demanding his resignation. Lawyers filed formal motions citing bias in his courtroom. Within weeks, cases he had presided over were being appealed en masse. His name, once feared, became a punchline whispered in corridors. And finally, one Friday morning, the headline landed: Judge Harker resigns amid scandal. There was no press conference. No dramatic farewell. Just a quiet exit through the back doors of a courthouse he had once ruled like a king. His robe folded under his arm, his eyes downcast, his legacy in ruins. But for the community, the story wasn't about his fall. It was about Danielle's stand. It was about dignity reclaimed, justice reminded. At the Sunday service in a packed church, the pastor referenced her without saying her name. Sometimes God sends a reminder, he said, his voice echoing through the sanctuary. A reminder that no matter how high arrogance climbs, truth will always bring it down. The congregation erupted, hands lifted, voices shouting Amen. In living rooms across town, families replayed the clip like it was scripture. In classrooms, teachers used it as a lesson in civics. And in whispered conversations, young girls began to imagine themselves not just in the gallery, but on the bench. Because Danielle Carter hadn't just defended her cousin. She had shown an entire community, and an entire country, what dignity looks like when it refuses to bow. And in the end, that was the real verdict. Arrogance will always wear a robe, a badge, a title. But power without humility is a mask that slips eventually. Danielle Carter reminded the world that true authority doesn't humiliate. It uplifts. It doesn't belittle. It respects. So the next time you see someone dismissed, mocked, or diminished for nothing but who they are, remember her stand. Remember the silence that turned into applause. And ask yourself, whose side of justice will you be on? Authority does not excuse arrogance. Justice belongs to all. Speak. Stand. Refuse silence. Because silence feeds injustice, but courage dismantles it. In the end, respect isn't something handed down from a robe, a gavel, or a title. Respect is a right, and when it's denied, it must be reclaimed. Danielle's stand wasn't just for herself. It was for every person ever silenced, dismissed, or humiliated. Her truth echoed beyond that courtroom and into a community that found its courage. If her story moved you, don't let it stop here. Share this video, subscribe Unheard Evidence for more unheard voices, and remember, justice begins when silence ends. Together, we make sure no story stays buried.